Hi everyone and welcome back. In my previous video, we took a look at the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and we discussed how the ICD and how the DSM defines that. And we looked at the similarities and the differences of those two different sets of diagnostic criteria. And what we found was that the DSM had some additional components in there that weren't in the ICD criteria. And the reason for that is the ICD-11 has an additional diagnosis called complex PTSD. So what makes PTSD complex? Well, let's take a look at the ICD and find out. So the first required feature is exposure to an event or a series of events of an extremely threatening or horrific nature, which are most commonly prolonged or repetitive events from which escape is difficult or impossible. So just as an aside here, the criteria for PTSD didn't mention this element of prolonged or repetitive from which escape is difficult or impossible. They've added this part in. And they go on to give some examples of what these events might look like. So please remember, these are just examples. They're to give some guidance and to give you an idea. It's not a list where you have to check something off it. So these events include torture, they include concentration camps, it includes slavery, it includes genocide campaigns and other forms of organized violence. It also includes prolonged domestic violence and repeated childhood sexual or physical abuse. So please remember, if you are watching this video and you're becoming unsettled or overwhelmed or dysregulated or coming outside your window of tolerance, then please practice some self-care. And don't forget, I've created some grounding videos on the channel for exactly this reason. The second requirement is that following the traumatic event, the development of all three core components of PTSD are present for at least several weeks. So I discussed those core components in my last video at length and in some detail. So I won't go into detail about them again, but to summarize, they were re-experiencing, which is more than just remembering. This is as if the experience is happening in the here and now. And usually these come as intrusive memories or as flashbacks or repetitive dreams or nightmares about the event. The second core component is a deliberate avoidance of reminders, which can be internal reminders, so thoughts or memories, or external reminders, such as people, conversations, activities, or situations that remind you of the event. And the third core component is persistent perception of heightened current threat. Sometimes we refer to this as hypervigilance, or people talk about an increased startle response. So those are the three core components from the criteria for PTSD. We now move on to three additional components that are unique to complex PTSD. And these three additional components are sometimes known as disturbances in self-organization. So the first one is severe and pervasive problems in affect regulation. Okay, affect is a clinical word for emotions, essentially. So this means problems in emotion regulation. And the ICD does give some examples of what this might look like in practice. So the ICD says this could look like heightened emotional reactivity to minor stressors. So you're becoming dysregulated at things that wouldn't normally make you dysregulated, to relatively minor stresses. Violent outbursts, reckless or self-destructive behavior, dissociative symptoms when under stress, emotional numbing, particularly the inability to experience pleasure or positive emotions. And the second additional component are persistent beliefs about oneself as diminished, defeated, or worthless, accompanied by deep and pervasive feelings of shame, guilt, or failure related to the stressor. For example, there might be guilt felt about not having escaped from or succumbing to the adverse circumstance, that somehow you were responsible for letting it happen to yourself. You didn't try and get away. Or not having been able to prevent the suffering of others. The third additional component are persistent difficulties in sustaining relationships and in feeling close to others. So you might constantly avoid or have little interest in relationships and social engagement. Or sometimes there might be occasional relationships, but these relationships are really intense. They're really intense in their nature and practically how they look, and they just become unsustainable. And then we have the same criteria in terms of functioning and quality of life as we do with PTSD. And that is that there must be significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. In other words, it has a major impact on your quality of life. So all of that seemed quite wordy. So I just want to summarize these additional components. So really what we have are problems in emotional regulation, beliefs about oneself as worthless, along with feelings of shame, guilt, or failure related to the event. And thirdly, difficulties in sustaining relationships and in feeling close to others. So those are the three additional components which are on top of the criteria for PTSD. And once again, I apologize for the very clinical nature of this video and its information delivery at this point, and perhaps coming across as a bit cold. But the reality is this is currently the language and the criteria that is used. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and to understand what these terms mean. And once we know what they mean and we understand these terms in their clinical context, we can take a look at slowly challenging it. We can have discussions around it because we're all using the same terms. And perhaps we can consider moving towards systems based on need rather than based on diagnostic criteria. So let me know what you think of this criteria. Are there any glaring holes in it that jump out at you, or experiences that aren't covered? I am genuinely interested, as that helps me to reflect on my own practice and how I can better understand my client's perspective and I can better advocate for them. Thanks for watching. Next video, we're going to be checking out developmental trauma. So if you're interested in that, then please consider subscribing to the channel and you will be notified or presented with that video when it is up. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for the support so far. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.